Hey friends, so this month we're going to revisit our commitment to the consecration of love in the context of marriage and singleness. And let me just begin by reading from our rule of life. The consecration of our love is a commitment to choose to embrace constraint for the purpose of refining, intensifying, and directing our love for God within a vocation of either celibacy while single or marriage. So friends, obviously this commitment is full of different paths that we could go down. We could talk about desire, as St. Augustine frames it. I plan to talk a little bit about desire. We could talk about the passions, and we could draw from the tradition of the early desert fathers, Evagrius of Ponticus in the 4th century, or John Cassian in the 5th century. They talked about the sort of internal drives and emotions. We could draw from that. We could talk about sex and sexuality. Oftentimes, a conversation about singleness ends up in a conversation about sex. There's probably a dozen or more ways that we could begin to talk about our commitment to the consecration of our love. And I share this with you here on the front side to simply say that as we look at this particular commitment, and really this is probably true of all of our commitments carry with it sort of deep possibility for theological reflection. And part of the invitation in the monastic life as we're reimagining it, and in this dispersed community that we have as a religious order, is a recognition that focusing our theological reflection in a particular direction over time helps us practice the implications of that theological reflection over time. So this stuff takes time. And so we want to be engaged in sustained theological reflection together. So simply put, the way that we think theologically about what we're doing is going to help us practice what we're doing. And so these monthly videos are sometimes going to be focused on really practical ways to help us engage in this work of living out our rule of life. And sometimes these videos will be a little bit more focused on developing our thinking around our commitments, specifically our theological understanding of these commitments. And in this video, I really want to do some of that deep theological work as it relates to this commitment to the consecration of our love. So at the center of our commitment to the consecration of love is a concept of a particular kind of love, which the Greeks called eros. And this is a love that desires to be in union with one another. It's the kind of love that desires connection with another. And this kind of love, it's a gift from God. It's meant to lead us back to God himself. And our whole reason for being created, and this is how Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers, says it, is so that we might participate in God, that we might receive the divine life in ourselves. And because that divine life is in us, it's closer to us than anything that's external to us. And this is actually one of the ways that we come to know God. We come to know God himself through the gift of himself into our life. So let me just sort of say that one more time a little bit differently. Our whole reason for being created, this is again, Gregory of Nyssa is saying this, is that we might receive in our life, in our own person, God's own divine life. Like this is God drawing near to us, indwelling us with his spirit, coming really close to us, always present to us in our own being. You've probably heard me say something like God has stitched himself to us. And the reason is that we might always have access to the experience of God and receive this as a gift. And so if you want to sort of visualize a picture with me and think with me a moment, maybe use your imagination. Imagine that God has carved out in you a space for him, and he has given you a longing, like a desire to have that space filled by him. So one of the early church fathers, again, John Chrysostom, talked about God's own desire for us to be bound with him. And he speaks of God as a lover. And he talks about his desire to be bound to God. So John Chrysostom says, I am wounded with a longing for God, which I think is really beautiful. The psalmist says it this way. He says, as the deer pants for the water, so my soul longs for you, O God. So this longing, this deep desire is called eros. And God has put that in us. He's put his divine love in us. And we have in us this desire to be joined to God. And this longing for God, this is an infinite longing. So the question, and I know we're going to get just a little bit philosophical here, but the question is, how can an infinite longing, an infinite love given from the Creator, how can that possibly be contained in a human body? Like, what do we do with that? Well, this happens through a process of refining, or what's called consecration. And there's a very real sense that we actually don't quite know how to manage this desire to be filled with the divine. And so we end up sort of filling up that God-shaped hole with so many other things. And we sort of have to learn how to manage this kind of deep, infinite love that's been placed inside of us. And so we have to learn to grow in our capacity to handle that. And so through the power of God's Spirit, we are learning to refine that love and focus that love and all of that desire towards God and towards others in ways that actually will honor God. To give back to God the love that he has poured into our hearts, and to give that love away to others, which God has asked us to do by his strength. So this is sort of the work that we're engaged in. Okay, so this is the theological foundation that we're working with when it comes to the concept of the consecration of love. And there are really two main ways that this love gets trained or refined. That's in marriage and in singleness. This is sort of how we're talking about this. And both of these ways are said to be a form of asceticism, a form of training. And there's some constraint involved in both of these ways of training our love. So let's first begin with marriage. Here's how this constraint works in marriage. The consecration of love in marriage becomes a form of training of our love and focusing our love onto one other person in a unique way. So it says, I will learn how to love this one person in a unique way that is different from my love for everyone else in this world. And this is why marriage is a form of asceticism. You're training to limit the way that love gets expressed, and you're allowing your love to be expressed in a particular way with this particular person, which means you're saying no to loving others in the exact same way that you're loving this one person. So there's some constraint built into marriage, obviously. And we could talk here about the sexual expression of eros, but we're going to leave that for another time. So in the married life, it says this. It says, I will learn to wield this love and focus this love on one person in this particular way. And through this relationship with this one person, I'm learning what it means to take this infinite energy and love and express it with the needs of others and their desires and limitations as part of my learning how to love them. So in the single life, what is learned is how to do all of that focusing and all of that directing of one's love without one particular place to practice. The pedagogy, or the way of learning in the single life, is a little bit different. It's not less than, it's just a different training program for the consecration of love. The question becomes something more like this. How do I learn to love in the way that God loves when there isn't one person to direct my love to, but rather, how do I learn to give my love out among many people? How do I learn to spread that love out? And so as I understand it, there are two different schools of learning how to love. The married life is a life that deals with the reality that says, all of this love that I have is meant to be given away. And I am learning how to refine my love by learning how to give this love away in a particular way to one person. And in the single life, the training is a little bit different. It's a training that says, all of this love I have is meant to be given away. And there's not one person that I'm meant to love in a particular way. I'm learning to love in a way that spreads that love out among many. And it turns out that what both married and single people end up learning is that the only place where our love can be fully expressed and contained is the love that is directed towards God. Like, the only place where that sort of infinite desire can land in its fullest expression is in God himself. So, friends, I know that there's a lot to think about here. I know that this particular video might feel a little bit heady. We're trying to get some theological foundational work done. Feel free to watch this a couple times. Feel free to ask questions in the comment section below. This is the theological and sort of philosophical foundation of the consecration of love. And there's some questions for you to think through this month, and I trust that as you pray through this theological concept, God will lead you into some practical reflection with how this is going to impact your life. Okay, much love, friends.